Chapter 4. That day, the birthday of Klara Olsufyevna, the only daughter of the civil councillor, Berendyev, at one time Mr. Golyadkin's benefactor and patron, was being celebrated by a brilliant and sumptuous dinner party. Such had not been seen for many a long day within the walls of the flats in the neighbourhood of Ismailovsky Bridge. A dinner more like some Balthazar's feast, with a suggestion of something Babylonian in its brilliant luxury and style, with Veuve-Clicquot champagne, with oysters and fruit from Eliseyev's and Milyutin's, with all sorts of fatted calves and all grades of the government service. This festive day was to conclude with a brilliant ball, a small birthday ball, but yet brilliant in its taste, its distinction, and its style. Of course, I am willing to admit that several balls do happen sometimes, though rarely. Such balls, more like family rejoicings than balls, can only be given in such houses of that civil councillor, Berendyev. I will say more, I even doubt if such balls could be given in the houses of all civil councillors. Oh, if I were a poet, such as Homer or Pushkin. I mean, of course, with any lesser talent one would not venture. I should certainly have painted all that glorious day for you, O my readers, with a free brush and brilliant colours. Yes, I should begin my poem with my dinner. I should lay special stress on that striking and solemn moment when the first goblet was raised to the honour of the Queen of the Feet. I should describe to you the guests plunged in a reverent silence and expectation, as eloquent as the rhetoric of Demosthenes. I should describe for you, then, how Andrei Filipovich, having as the elder of the guests some right to take precedence, adorned with his grey hairs and the orders that will befit grey hairs, got up from his seat and raised above his head the congratulatory glass of sparkling wine, brought from a distant kingdom to celebrate such occasions and more like heavenly nectar than plain wine. I would describe for you how the same Andrei Filipovich, so often mentioned, after dropping a tear in his glass, delivered his congratulations and good wishes, proposed the toast and drank the health. But I confess, I freely confess, that I could not do justice to that solemn moment when the Queen of the Feet, Klara Olsufyevna, blushing like a rose in spring, with a glow of bliss and of modesty, was so overcome by her feelings that she sank into the arms of her tender mamma. How that tender mamma shed tears, and how her father, Olsufy Ivanovitch, a hale old man and a privy councillor, who had lost the use of his legs in his long years of service, and had been rewarded by destiny for his devotion with investments, a house, some small estates, and a beautiful daughter, sobbed like a little child, and announced through his tears that His Excellency was a benevolent man. I could not, I positively could not, describe the enthusiasm that followed that moment in every heart, an enthusiasm clearly evinced in the conduct of a youthful register clerk, though at that moment he was more like a civil councillor than a register clerk, who was moved to tears too, as he listened to Andrei Filipovich. In his turn, too, Andrei Filipovich was in that solemn moment, quite unlike a collegiate councillor, and the head of an office in the department. Yes, he was something else. What exactly I do not know, but not a collegiate councillor. He was more exalted. Finally, oh, why do I not possess the secret of lofty, powerful language, of the sublime style, to describe these grand and edifying moments of human life, which seem created expressly to prove that virtue sometimes triumphs over ingratitude, free thinking, vice, and envy. I will say nothing, but in silence, which will be better than any eloquence, I will point to that fortunate youth, just entering on his 26th spring, to Vladimir Semyonovitch, Andrei Filipovich's nephew, who in his turn now rose from his seat, who in his turn proposed a toast, and upon whom were fastened the tearful eyes of the parents, the proud eyes of Andrei Filipovich, the modest eyes of the Queen of the Feet, the solemn eyes of the guests, and even the decorously envious eyes of some of the young man's youthful colleagues. I will say nothing of that, though I cannot refrain from observing that everything in that young man, who was, indeed, speaking in a complimentary sense, more like an elderly than a young man, everything, from his blooming cheeks to his accessorial rank, seemed almost to proclaim aloud the lofty pinnacle a man can attain through morality and good principles. I will not describe how Anton Antonovitch Syetochkin, a little old man as grey as a badger, the head clerk of a department, who was a colleague of Andrei Filipovich's and had once also been of Olsufy Ivanovich's, and was an old friend of the family and Klara Olsufyevna's godfather. In his turn proposed a toast, crowed like a cock, and cracked many little jokes. How by this extremely proper breach of propriety, if one may use such an expression, he made the whole company laugh until they cried, and how Klara Olsufyevna, at her parents' bidding, rewarded him for his jocularity and politeness with a kiss. I will only say that the guests, who must have felt like kinsfolk and brothers after such a dinner, at last rose from the table, and the elderly and more solid guests, after a brief interval spent in friendly conversation, interspersed with some candid, though of course very polite and proper observations, went decorously into the next room, and, without losing valuable time, promptly divided themselves up into parties, and, full of the sense of their own dignity, installed themselves at tables covered with green baize. Meanwhile, the ladies established in the drawing-room suddenly became very affable and began talking about dress materials, and the venerable host, who had lost the use of his legs in the service of loyalty and religion, and had been rewarded with all the blessings we have enumerated above, began walking about on crutches amongst his guests, supported by Vladimir Semyonovich and Klara Olsufyevna, and he, too, suddenly became extremely affable, decided to improvise a modest little dance, regardless of expense. To that end, a nimble youth, the one who was more like a civil councillor than a youth, was dispatched to fetch musicians, and musicians to the number of 11 arrived, and exactly at 8:30 struck up the inviting strains of a French quadrille, followed by various other dances. It is needless to say that my pen is too weak, dull, and spiritless to describe the dance that owed its inspiration to the genial hospitality of the grey-headed host. And how, I ask, can the modest chronicler of Mr. Golyadkin's adventures, extremely interesting as they are in their own way, how can I depict the choice and rare mingling of beauty, brilliance, style, gaiety, polite solidity, and solid politeness, sportiveness, joy, all the mirth and playfulness of these wives and daughters of petty officials, more like fairies than ladies, in a complimentary sense, with their lily shoulders and their rosy faces, their ethereal figures, their playfully agile, homeopathic, to use the exalted language appropriate, little feet. How can I describe to you, finally, the gallant officials, their partners, gay and solid youths, steady, gleeful, decorously vague, smoking a pipe in the intervals between the dancing in a little green room apart, or not smoking a pipe in the intervals between the dances, every one of them with a highly respectable surname and rank in their service, all steeped in a sense of the elegant and a sense of their own dignity, almost all speaking French to their partners, or if Russian, using only the most well-bred expressions, compliments, and profound observations, and only in the smoking room permitting themselves some genial lapses from this high tone, some phrases of cordial and friendly brevity, such, for instance, as, "Upon my soul, Petka, you rake, you did kick me off that polka in style," or, "I say, Vazia, you dog, you did your partner a time of it." For all this, as I've already had the honor of explaining, oh my readers, my pen fails me, and therefore I am dumb. Let us rather return to Mr. Golyadkin, the true and only hero of my very truthful tale. The fact is that he found himself now in a very strange position, to the least of it. He was here also, gentlemen. That is, not at the dance, but almost at the dance. He was all right, though. He could take care of himself. Yet at that moment he was a little astray. He was standing at that moment, strange to say, on the landing of the back stairs to Olsufy Ivanovich's flat. But it was all right, his standing there. He was quite well. He was standing in a corner, huddled in a place which was not very warm, though it was dark, partly hidden by a huge cupboard and an old screen, in the midst of rubbish, litter, and odds and ends of all sorts, concealing himself for the time being and watching the course of proceedings as a disinterested spectator. He was only looking on now, gentlemen. He too, gentlemen, might go in, of course. Why should he not go in? He had only to take one step and he go in, and would go in very adroitly. Just now, though he had been standing nearly 3 hours between the cupboard and the screen in the midst of the rubbish, litter and odds and ends of all sorts. He was only quoting, in his own justification, a memorable phrase of the French minister, Villiers. All things come in time to him who has the strength to wait. Mr. Golyadkin had read this sentence in some book on quite a different subject, but now very aptly recalled it. The phrase, to begin with, was exceedingly appropriate to his present position, and indeed, why should it not occur to the mind of a man who had been waiting for almost 3 hours in the cold and the dark in expectation of a happy ending to his adventures? After quoting very appropriately the phrase of the French minister, Villiers, Mr. Golyadkin immediately thought of the Turkish vizier, Martsemiris, as well as of the beautiful Margravine Louise, whose story he had also read in some book. Then it occurred to his mind that the Jesuits made it their rule that any means were justified if only the ends were attained. Fortifying himself somewhat with this historical fact, Mr. Golyadkin said to himself, what were the Jesuits? The Jesuits were every one of them very great fools. That he was better than any of them. That if only the refreshment room would be empty for 1 minute. The door of the refreshment room opened straight into the passage to the back stairs, where Mr. Golyadkin was in hiding now. He would, in spite of all the Jesuits in the world, go straight in, first from the refreshment room into the tea room, then into the room where they were now playing cards, and then straight into the hall where they were now dancing the polka. He would go in, he would slip through, and that would be all. No one would notice him, and once there, he would know what to do. Well, so this is the position in which we find the hero of our perfectly true story, though indeed, it is difficult to explain what was passing in him at that moment. The fact is that he had made his way to the back of the stairs and to the passage, on the grounds that, as he said, why shouldn't he? And everyone did go that way, but he had not ventured to penetrate further. Evidently he did not dare to do so. Not because there was anything he did not dare, but just because he did not care to, because he preferred to be in hiding. So there he was, waiting now for a chance to slip in, and he had been waiting for it 2 hours and a half. Why not wait? Villiers himself had waited, but what had Villiers to do with it? Thought Mr. Golyadkin. How does Villiers come in? But how am I to go and walk in? Ech, you dummy, thought Mr. Golyadkin, pinching his benumbed cheek with his benumbed fingers. You silly fool, you silly old Golyadkin, silly fool of a surname. But these compliments paid to himself were only by the way, and without any apparent aim. Now he was on the point of pushing forward and slipping in. The refreshment room was empty, and no one was in sight. Mr. Golyadkin saw all this through the little window. In 2 steps he was at the door and had already opened it. Should he come in or not? Come, should he, or not? I'll go in. Why not? To the bold always lie open. Reassuring himself in this way, our hero suddenly and quite unexpectedly retreated behind the screen. No, he thought. Ah, no, someone's coming in? Yes, they've come in. Why did I dawdle when there were no people about? Even so, shall I go and slip in? No, I'll slip in when a man has such a temperament. Fie, what a low tendency. I'm as scared as a hen. Being scared is our special line. That's the fact of the matter. To be abject on every occasion is our line. No need to ask about that. Just stand here like a post, and that's all. At home I should be having a cup of tea now. It would be pleasant, too, to have a cup of tea. If I come in later, Petrushka'll grumble, maybe. Should I go home? Damnation take all this. I'll go, and that's the end of it. Reflecting on his position in this way, Mr. Golyadkin dashed forward, as though someone had touched a spring in him. In 2 steps he found himself in the refreshment room, flung off his overcoat, took off his hat, hurriedly thrust these things into a corner, straightened himself and smoothed himself down. Then he moved on to the tea room, and from the tea room darted into the next room, slipped almost unnoticed between the card players, who were at the tip-top of excitement. Then Mr. Golyadkin forgot everything that was going around him, and went straight as an arrow into the drawing room. As luck would have it, they were not dancing. The ladies were promenading up and down the room in picturesque groups. The gentlemen were standing about in twos and threes, or flitting about the room engaging partners. Mr. Golyadkin noticed something of this. He saw only Klara Olsufyevna, near her Andrei Filipovich, then Vladimir Semyonovich, 2 or 3 officers, and finally 2 or 3 other young men who were also very interesting, and as anyone could see at once, were either very promising or had actually done something. He saw someone else too, or rather, he saw nobody and looked at nobody, but moved by the same spring which had sent him dashing into the midst of the ball, which he had not been invited. He moved forward, and then forwarder and forwarder. On the way he jostled against a councillor and trod on his foot, and incidentally stepped on a very venerable old lady's dress, and tore it a little, pushed against a servant with a tray, and then ran against somebody else, and, not noticing all this, pressing further and further forward, he suddenly found himself facing Klara Olsufyevna. There is no doubt whether that he would, with the utmost delight, without winking an eyelid, have sunk through the earth at that moment. But what has once been done cannot be recalled, can never be recalled. What was he to do? If I fail, I don't lose heart. If I succeed, I persevere. Mr. Golyadkin was, of course, not one to intrigue, and not accomplished in the art of polishing the floor with his boots. And so indeed it proved. Besides, the Jesuits had some hand in it too, though Mr. Golyadkin had no thoughts to spare for them now. All the moving, noisy, laughing groups were suddenly hushed as though at a signal and, little by little, crowded round Mr. Golyadkin. He, however, seemed to hear nothing, to see nothing. He could not look, he could not possibly look at anything. He kept his eyes on the floor, and so stood, giving himself his word of honor, in passing, to shoot himself one way or another that night. Making this vow, Mr. Golyadkin inwardly said to himself, "Here goes," and to his own great astonishment, began unexpectedly to speak. He began with congratulations and polite wishes. The congratulations went off well, but over the good wishes our hero stammered. He felt that if he stammered all would be lost at once. And so it turned out, he stammered and floundered. Floundering, he blushed crimson. Blushing, he was overcome with confusion. In his confusion, he raised his eyes. Raising his eyes, he looked about him. Looking about him, he almost swooned. Everyone stood still. Everyone was silent. A little nearer, there was laughter. Mr. Golyadkin fastened a humble, imploring look at Andrei Filipovich. Andrei Filipovich responded with such a look that if our hero had not been utterly crushed already, he certainly would have been crushed a second time. That is, if it were possible. The silence lasted long. "This is rather concerned with my domestic circumstances and my private life, Andrei Filipovich," our hero, half dead, articulated in a scarcely audible voice. "It is not an official incident, Andrei Filipovich." "For shame, sir, for shame," Andrei Filipovich pronounced in a half-whisper, with an indescribable air of indignation. He pronounced these words, and, giving Klara Olsufyevna his arm, he turned away from Mr. Golyadkin. "I've nothing to be ashamed of, Andrei Filipovich," answered Mr. Golyadkin, also in a whisper, turning his miserable eyes about him, trying helplessly to discover in the amazed crowd something on which he would gain a footing and retrieve his social position. "Why, it's all right. It's nothing, gentlemen. Why, what's the matter? Why, it might happen to anyone," whispered Mr. Golyadkin, moving a little away and trying to escape from the crowd surrounding him. They made way for him. Our hero passed through 2 rows of inquisitive and wondering spectators. Fate drew him on. He felt himself that fate was leading him on. He would have given a great deal, of course, for a chance to be back in the passage by the back stairs, without having committed a breach of propriety. But as that were utterly impossible, he began trying to creep away into a corner and to stand there, modestly, decorously, apart, without interfering with anyone, without attracting especial attention, but at the same time to win the favorable notice of his host and the company. At the same time, Mr. Golyadkin felt as though the ground were giving way under him, as though he was staggering, falling. At last he made his way to a corner and stood in it, like an unconcerned, rather indifferent spectator, leaning his arms on the backs of 2 chairs, taking complete possession of them in that way, and trying as far as he could to glance confidently at Olsufy Ivanovich's guests. Standing nearest him was an officer, a tall and handsome fellow, beside whom Golyadkin felt himself an insect. "These 2 chairs, Lieutenant, are intended, one for Klara Olsufyevna and the other for Princess Shevchenov. I'm taking care of them for them," said Mr. Golyadkin, breathlessly, turning his imploring eyes on the officer. The lieutenant said nothing, but turned away with a murderous smile. Checked in this direction, our hero was about to try his luck in another quarter, and directly addressed an important councillor with a cross of great distinction on his breast. But the councillor looked him up and down with such a frigid stare that Mr. Golyadkin felt distinctly as though the whole bucketful of cold water had been thrown over him. He subsided into silence. He made up his mind that it was better to keep quiet, not to open his lips, and to show that he was all right, that he was like everyone else, and that his position, as far as he could see, was quite a proper one. With this object, he riveted his gaze on the lining of his coat, then raised his eyes and fixed them upon a very respectable-looking gentleman. "That gentleman has a wig on," thought Mr. Golyadkin, "and if he takes off that wig, he will be bald. His head will be as bare as the palm of my hand." Having made this important discovery, Mr. Golyadkin thought of the Arab emirs, whose heads were left bare and shaven if they take off the green turbans they wear as a sign of their descent from the Prophet Muhammad. Then, probably from some special connection of ideas with the Turks, he thought of Turkish slippers and at once, apropos of that, recalled the fact that Andrei Filipovich was wearing boots, and that his boots were more like slippers than boots. It was evident that Mr. Golyadkin had become, to some extent, reconciled to his position. What if that chandelier, flashed through Mr. Golyadkin's mind, were to come down from the ceiling and fall upon the company? I should rush at once to save Klara Olsufyevna. "Save her!" I should cry. "Don't be alarmed, madam. It's of no consequence. I will rescue you. Then—" At that moment, Mr. Golyadkin looked about in search of Klara Olsufyevna, and saw Gerasimych, Olsufy Ivanovich's old butler. Gerasimych, with a most anxious and solemnly official air, was making straight for him. Mr. Golyadkin started and frowned from an unaccountable but most disagreeable sensation. He looked about him mechanically. It occurred to his mind that, if only he could somehow creep off somewhere, unobserved, on the sly, simply disappear, that is, behave as though he had done nothing at all, as though the matter did not concern him in the least. But before our hero could make up his mind to do anything, Gerasimych was standing before him. "Do you see, Gerasimych?" said our hero, with a little smile, addressing Gerasimych. "You go and tell them. Do you see the candle there in the chandelier, Gerasimych? It will be falling down directly. So you know. You must tell them to see to it. It will really fall down, Gerasimych." The candle. No, the candle's standing straight, but somebody is asking for you, sir. Who is asking for me, Gerasimych? I really can't say, sir, who it is. A man with a message. Is Yakov Petrovich Golyadkin here? Says he. Then call him out, says he. On very urgent and important business, you see. Now, Gerasimych, you are making a mistake. In that you are making a mistake, Gerasimych. I doubt it, sir. No, Gerasimych, it isn't doubtful. There's nothing doubtful about it, Gerasimych. Nobody's asking for me, but I'm quite at home here. That is in my right place, Gerasimych. Mr. Golyadkin took breath and looked around him. Yes, everyone in the room, all had their eyes fixed upon him, and were listening in a sort of solemn expectation. The man had crowded a little nearer, and were all attention. A little further away, the ladies were whispering together. The master of the house made his appearance at no great distance from Mr. Golyadkin, and though it were impossible to detect from his expression that he, too, was taking a close and direct interest in Mr. Golyadkin's position, for everything was being done with delicacy, yet nevertheless, it all made our hero feel that the decisive moment had come for him. Mr. Golyadkin saw clearly that the time had come for an old stroke, the chance of putting his enemies to shame. Mr. Golyadkin was in great agitation. He was aware of a sort of inspiration, and, in a quivering and impressive voice, he began again, addressing the waiting butler. "No, my dear fellow, no one's calling for me. You are mistaken. I will say more, you were mistaken this morning, too, when you assured me, dared to assure me, I say," he raised his voice, "that Olsufy Ivanovitch, who had been my benefactor for as long as I can remember, and has, in a sense, been a father to me, was shutting his door upon me at the moment of solemn family rejoicing for his paternal heart." Mr. Golyadkin looked about him complacently, but with deep feeling. A tear glittered on his eyelash. "I repeat, my friend," our hero continued, "you were mistaken. You were cruelly and unpardonably mistaken." The moment was a solemn one. Mr. Golyadkin felt that the effect was quite certain. He stood with modestly downcast eyes, expecting Olsufy Ivanovitch to embrace him. Excitement and perplexity were apparent in the guests. Even the inflexible and terrible Gerasimych faltered over the words, "I doubt it," when suddenly the ruthless orchestra, apropos of nothing, struck up a polka. All was lost, all was scattered to the winds. Mr. Golyadkin started, Gerasimych stepped back, everything in the room began undulating like the sea, and Vladimir Semyonovitch led the dance with Klara Olsufyevna, while the handsome lieutenant followed with Princess Shevchenko. Onlookers, curious and delighted, squeezed in to watch them dancing the polka, an interesting, fashionable new dance with which everyone was crazy over. Mr. Golyadkin was, for the time, forgotten. But suddenly, all were thrown into excitement, confusion, and bustle. The music ceased. A strange incident had occurred. Tired out with the dance, and almost breathless with fatigue, Klara Olsufyevna, with glowing cheeks and heaving bosom, sank into an armchair, completely exhausted. All hearts turned to the fascinating creature. All vied with one another in complimenting her and thanking her for the pleasure conferred on them. All at once there stood before her Mr. Golyadkin. He was pale, extremely perturbed. He, too, seemed completely exhausted. He could scarcely move. He was smiling for some reason. He stretched out his hand imploringly. Klara Olsufyevna was so taken aback that she had not time to withdraw hers, and mechanically got up at his invitation. Mr. Golyadkin lurched forward, first once, then a second time, then lifted his leg, then made a scrape, then gave a sort of stamp, then stumbled. He, too, wanted to dance with Klara Olsufyevna. Klara Olsufyevna uttered a shriek. Everyone rushed to release her hand from Mr. Golyadkin's. And in a moment, our hero was carried almost 10 paces away by the rush of the crowd. A circle formed around him, too. 2 old ladies, whom he had almost knocked down in his retreat, raised a great shrieking and outcry. The confusion was awful. All were asking questions. Everyone was shouting. Everyone was finding fault. The orchestra was silent. Our hero whirled around in his circle and, mechanically, with a semblance of a smile, muttered something to himself, such as, "Why not?" and that the polka so far, at least as he could see, was a new and very interesting dance, invented for the diversion of the ladies, but that since things had taken this turn, he was ready to consent. But Mr. Golyadkin's consent no one apparently thought of asking. Our hero was suddenly aware that someone's hand was laid on his arm, that another hand was pressed against his back, that he was, with peculiar solitude, being guided in a certain direction. At last he noticed he was going straight to the door. Mr. Golyadkin wanted to say something, to do something, but no, he no longer waited to do anything. He only mechanically kept laughing in an answer. At last he was aware they were putting on his greatcoat, that his hat was thrust over his eyes. Finally he felt that he was in the entry on the stairs in the dark and cold. At last he stumbled. He felt he was falling down a precipice. He tried to cry out, and suddenly he found himself in the courtyard. The air blew fresh on him. He stood still for a moment. At that very instant, the strains reached him of the orchestra striking up again. Mr. Golyadkin suddenly recalled it all. It seemed to him that his flagging energies came back to him again. He had been standing as though riveted to the sport, but now he started off and rushed away, headlong, anywhere, into the air, into freedom, whatever chance might take him. Chapter 5. It was striking midnight from all the clock towers in Petersburg, when Mr. Golyadkin, beside himself, ran out on the Fontanka Quay. close to the Ismailovsky Bridge, fleeing from his foes, from persecution, from a hailstorm of nips and pinches aimed at him, from the shrieks of excited old ladies, from the ohs and ahs of women, and from the murderous eyes of Andrei Filipovich. Mr. Golyadkin was killed entirely, in the full sense of the word, and if he still preserved the power of running, it was simply through some sort of miracle, a miracle in which at last he refused to believe. It was an awful November night, wet, foggy, rainy, snowy, teeming with colds in the head, fevers, swollen faces, quinsys, inflammations of all kinds and descriptions, teeming, in fact, with all the gifts of a Petersburg November. The wind howled in the deserted streets, lifting up the black water of the canal above the rings on the bank, and irritably brushing against the lean lampposts, which chimed in with its howling in a shrill creak, keeping up the endless squeaky, jangling concert with which every inhabitant of Petersburg is so familiar. Snow and rain were both falling at once. Lashed by the wind, the streams of rainwater spurted almost horizontally, as though from a fireman's hose, pricking and stinging the face of the luckless Mr. Golyadkin, like 1,000 pins and needles. In the stillness of the night, broken only by the distant rumblings of carriages, the howl of the wind and the creaking of the lampposts, there was the dismal sound of the splash and gurgle of water, rushing from every roof, every porch, every pipe and every cornice, onto the granite of the pavement. There was not a soul, near or far. It seemed there could not be such an hour and in such weather. And so only Mr. Golyadkin, alone with his despair, was fleeing in terror along the pavement of Fontanka, with his usual rapid little step, in haste to get home as soon as possible to his flat on the 4th-floor story in Shestilovozhny Street. Though the snow, the rain, and all the nameless horrors of a raging snowstorm and fog under a Petersburg November sky were attacking Mr. Golyadkin, already shattered by misfortunes, were showing him no mercy, giving him no rest, drenching him to the bone, gluing up his eyelids, blowing right through him from all sides, baffling and perplexing him, though conspiring and combining with all his enemies to make a grand day, evening, and a night for him. In spite of all this, Mr. Golyadkin was almost insensible to this final proof of the persecution of destiny. So violent had the shock and the impression been made upon him a few minutes before at the civil councillor Berendyev's. If any disinterested spectator could have glanced casually at Mr. Golyadkin's painful progress, he would certainly have said that Mr. Golyadkin looked as though he wanted to hide from himself, as though he were trying to run from himself. Yes, it was really so. One may say more. Mr. Golyadkin did not only want to run from himself, but to be obliterated, to cease to be, to return to dust. At the moment, he took in nothing surrounding him, understood nothing of what was going on around him, and looked as though the miseries of the stormy night, of the long tramp, the rain, the snow, the wind, or the cruelty of the weather, did not exist for him. The golosh slipping off the boot onto Mr. Golyadkin's right foot was left behind in the snow and slush on the pavement of Fontanka, and Mr. Golyadkin did not think of turning back to get it, did not, in fact, notice that he had lost it. He was so perplexed that, in spite of everything around him, he stood several times stock in the middle of the pavement, completely possessed by the thought of his recent horrible humiliation. And that instant he was dying, disappearing. Then he suddenly set off again like mad, and ran without looking back, as though he were pursued, as though he were fleeing from some still more awful calamity. The position was truly awful. At last Mr. Golyadkin halted in exhaustion, leaned on the railing in the attitude of a man whose nose had suddenly begun to bleed, and began looking intensely at the black and troubled waters of the canal. All that is known is that at that instant, Mr. Golyadkin reached such a pitch of despair, was so harassed, so tortured, so exhausted, and so weakened in what feeble faculties were left him, that he forgot everything. Forgot the Ismailovsky Bridge, forgot Shestilovozhny Street, forgot his present plight. After all, what did it matter to him? The thing was done. The decision was affirmed and ratified. What could he do? All at once he started and involuntarily skipped a couple of paces aside. With unaccountable uneasiness, he began gazing about him, But no one was there. Nothing special had happened, and yet he fancied that just now, that very minute, someone was standing near him, beside him, also leaning on the railing and, marvelous to relate, had even said something to him, said something quickly, abruptly, not quite intelligibly, but something quite private, something concerning himself.
"Why, was it my fancy?"
said Mr. Golyadkin, looking round once more.
"But where am I standing?"
He thought finally, shaking his head, though he began gazing with an uneasy, miserable feeling into the damp, murky distance, straining his sight and doing his utmost to pierce with his short-sighted eyes the wet darkness that stretched all around him. There was nothing new, however, nothing special caught the eye of Mr. Golyadkin. Everything seemed to be all right, as it should be. That is, the snow was falling more violently, more thickly and in larger flakes. Nothing could be seen 20 paces away. The lamppost creaked more shrilly than ever, and the wind seemed to intone its melancholy song even more tearfully, more piteously, like an importune beggar whining for a copper to get a crust of bread. At the same time, a new sensation took possession of Mr. Golyadkin's whole being. Agony upon agony, terror upon terror. A feverish tremor ran through his veins. The moment was insufferably unpleasant.
"Well, no matter. Perhaps it's no matter at all, and there's no stain on anyone's honor. Perhaps it's all as it should be,"
he went on, without understanding what he was saying.
"Perhaps it will all be for the best in the end, and there will be nothing to complain of, and everyone will be justified."
Talking like this and comforting himself with words, Mr. Golyadkin shook himself a little, shook off the snow which had drifted in thick layers on his hat, his collar, his overcoat, his tie, his boots, and everything. But his strange feeling, his strange obscure misery he could not get rid of, could not shake off. Somewhere in the distance, there was the boom of a cannon shot.
"Ah, what weather,"
thought our hero.
"Phew, isn't there going to be a flood? It seems as though the water has risen so violently."
Mr. Golyadkin had hardly said or thought this, when he saw a person coming towards him, belated, no doubt, like him, through some accident. An unimportant, casual incident, one might suppose. But for some unknown reason, Mr. Golyadkin was troubled, even scared, and rather flurried. It was not that he was exactly afraid of some ill-intentioned man, but just that, after all, who knows this belated individual, flashed through Mr. Golyadkin's mind.
Maybe he's that very thing. Maybe he's the very principal thing in me, and isn't here for nothing, but is here with an object, crossing my path and provoking me.
Possibly, however, he did not think this precisely, but only had a passing feeling of something like it, and very unpleasant. There was no time, however, for thinking and feeling. The stranger was already within 2 paces. Mr. Golyadkin, as he invariably did, hastened to assume a quite particular air, an air that expressed clearly that he, Mr. Golyadkin, kept himself to himself, that he was all right, that the road was wide enough for all, and that he, Golyadkin, was not interfering with anyone. Suddenly he stopped short as though petrified, as though struck by lightning, and quickly turned round after the figure which had only just passed him, turned as though someone had given him a tug from behind, as though the wind had turned him like a weathercock. The passer-by vanished quickly in the snowstorm. He too walked quickly. He was dressed like Mr. Golyadkin, and, like him too, wrapped up from head to foot, and he too tripped and trotted along the pavement of Fontanka with rapid little steps that suggested he was a little scared. What is it?" whispered Mr. Golyadkin, smiling mistrustfully, though he trembled all over. An icy shiver ran down his back. Meanwhile, the stranger had vanished completely. There was no sound of his step, while Mr. Golyadkin still stood and gazed after him. At last, however, he gradually came to himself.
"Why, what's the meaning of it?"
he thought with vexation.
"Why, have I really gone out of my mind, or what?"
He turned and went on his way, making his footsteps more rapid and frequent, and doing his best not to think of anything at all. He even closed his eyes at last with the same object. Suddenly, through the howling of the wind and the uproar of the storm, the sound of steps very close at hand reached his ears again. He started and opened his eyes. Again, a rapidly approaching figure stood out black before him, some 20 paces away. This little figure was hastening, tripping along, hurrying nervously. The distance between them grew rapidly less. Mr. Golyadkin could, by now, get a full view of the second belated companion. He looked full at him and cried out with amazement and horror. His legs gave way under him. It was the same individual who had passed him 10 minutes before, and who now quite unexpectedly turned up facing him again. But this was not the only marvel that struck Mr. Golyadkin. He was so amazed that he stood out, cried out, tried to say something, and rushed to overtake the stranger, even shouted something to him, probably anxious to stop him as quickly as possible. The stranger did, in fact, stop 10 paces from Mr. Golyadkin, so that the light from the lamppost that stood near fell full upon his whole figure. Stood still, turned to Mr. Golyadkin, and with impatient and anxious face, waited to hear what he had to say.
"Excuse me, possibly I'm mistaken,"
our hero brought out in a quavering voice. The stranger, in silence and with an air of annoyance, turned and rapidly went on his way, as though in haste to make up for the 2 seconds he had wasted on Mr. Golyadkin. As for the latter, he was quivering in every nerve. His knees shook and gave way under him, and with a moan he squatted on a stone at the edge of the pavement. There really was reason, however, for his being so overwhelmed. The fact is that this stranger seemed to him somehow familiar. That would have been nothing, though. But he recognized, almost certainly recognized this man. He had often seen him, that man, had seen him some time, and very lately too. Where could it have been? Surely not yesterday. But, again, that was not the chief thing that Mr. Golyadkin had often seen him before. There was hardly anything special about the man. The man at first sight would not have aroused any special attention. He was just a man like everyone else, a gentleman like all other gentlemen, of course. And perhaps he had some good qualities and very valuable ones too. In fact, he was a man who was quite himself. Mr. Golyadkin cherished no sort of hatred or enmity, not even the slightest hostility toward this man. Quite the contrary, it would seem, indeed, and yet, and this was the real point, he would not for any treasure on earth have been willing to meet that man, and especially to meet him as he had done now, for instance. We may say more. Mr. Golyadkin knew that man perfectly well. He even knew what he was called, what his name was, and yet nothing would have induced him, and again, for no treasure on earth would he have consented to name him, to consent to acknowledge that he was called so-and-so, that his father's name was this, and his surname was that. Whether Mr. Golyadkin's stupefaction lasted a short time or a long time, whether he was sitting for a long time on the stone of the pavement, I cannot say. But, recovering himself a little at last, he suddenly fell to running, without looking round, as fast as his legs could carry him. His mind was preoccupied. Twice he stumbled and almost fell, and through this circumstance, his other boot was also bereaved of its golosh. At last Mr. Golyadkin slackened his pace a little to get breath, looked hurriedly round and saw that he had already, without being aware of it, run past part of the Nevsky Prospect, and was now standing at the turning point into Litany Street. Mr. Golyadkin turned into Litany Street. His position at that instant was like that of a man standing at the edge of a fearful precipice, while the earth is bursting open under him, is already shaking, moving, rocking for the last time, falling, drawing him into the abyss. And yet, the luckless wretch had not the strength, nor the resolution, to leap back, to avert his eyes from the yawning gulf below. The abyss draws him, and at last he leaps into it of himself hastening the moment of destruction. Mr. Golyadkin knew, felt, and was firmly convinced that some other evil was certainly before him on the way, that some unpleasantness would overtake him, that he would, for instance, meet his stranger once more. But, strange to say, he positively desired this meeting, considered it inevitable, and all he asked was that it might be quickly all over, that he should be relieved from his position in one way or another, but as soon as possible. And meanwhile, he ran on and on, as though moved by some external force, for he felt a weakness and numbness in his whole being. He could not think of anything, though his thoughts cast at everything like brambles. A little lost dog, soaked and shivering, attached itself to Mr. Golyadkin, and ran beside him, scurrying along with tail and ears drooping, looking at him from time to time with timid comprehension. Some remote, long-forgotten idea, some memory of something that happened long ago, came back into his mind now, kept knocking at his brain as with a hammer, vexing him and refusing to be shaken off.
That horrible little care,
whispered Mr. Golyadkin, not understanding himself. At last he saw his stranger at the turning into Italnatsky Street. But this time, the stranger was not coming to meet him, but was running in the same direction as he was, and he too was running, a few steps in front. At last they turned into Shestilovochny Street. Mr. Golyadkin caught his breath. The stranger stopped exactly before the house in which Mr. Golyadkin lodged. He heard a ring at the bell, and almost at the same time, the grating of the iron bolt. The gate opened, the stranger stopped, darted in, and disappeared. Almost at the same instant, Mr. Golyadkin reached the spot, and like an arrow, flew in at the gate. Heedless of the grumbling porter, he ran, gasping for breath, into the yard, and immediately saw his interesting companion, whom he had lost sight of for a moment. The stranger darted towards the staircase which led into Mr. Golyadkin's flat. Mr. Golyadkin rushed after him. The stairs were dark, damp and dirt. At every turning, there were heaped up masses of refuse from the flats, so that any unaccustomed stranger who found himself on the stairs in the dark was forced to travel to and fro for half an hour, in danger of breaking his legs, cursing the stairs as well as the friends who lived in such an inconvenient place. But Mr. Golyadkin's companion seemed as though familiar with it, as though at home. He ran up lightly, without difficulty, showing a perfect knowledge of his surroundings. Mr. Golyadkin had almost caught him up. In fact, once or twice the stranger's coat flicked him on the nose. His heart stood still. The stranger stopped before the door of Mr. Golyadkin's flat, knocked on it, and, which would, however, have surprised Mr. Golyadkin at any other time, Petrushka, as though he had been sitting up in expectation, opened the door at once, and, with a candle in his hand, followed the strange as the latter went in. The hero of our story dashed into the lodging beside himself. Without taking off his hat or coat, he crossed the little passage and stood still in the doorway of his room, as though thunderstruck. All his presentiments had come true. All that he had dreamed and surmised was coming to pass in reality. His breath failed him. His head was in a whirl. The stranger, also in his coat and hat, was sitting before him on his bed, and with a faint smile, screwing up his eyes, nodded to him in a friendly way. Mr. Golyadkin wanted to scream, but could not, to protest in some way, but his strength failed him. His hair stood on end, and he almost fell down in horror. And indeed, there was good reason. He recognized his nocturnal visitor. The nocturnal visitor was no other than himself, Mr. Golyadkin himself, another Mr. Golyadkin, but absolutely the same as himself. In fact, what is called a double in every respect. Chapter 6. At 8 o'clock next morning, Mr. Golyadkin woke up in his bed. At once all the extraordinary incidents of the previous day and the wild, incredible night, with all its almost impossible adventures, presented themselves to his imagination and memory with terrifying vividness. Such intense, diabolical malice on the part of his enemies and, above all, the final proof of that malice froze Mr. Golyadkin's heart. But at the same time, it was all so strange, incomprehensible, wild, it seemed so impossible, that it was really hard to credit the whole business. Mr. Golyadkin was, indeed, ready to admit himself that it was all an incredible delusion, a passing aberration of the fancy, a darkening of the mind, if he had not fortunately known by bitter experience to what lengths spite will sometimes carry anyone, what a pitch of ferocity an enemy may reach when he is bent on revenging his honor and prestige. Besides, Mr. Golyadkin's exhausted limbs, his heavy head, his aching back, and the malignant cold in his head bore vivid witness to the probability of his expedition of the previous night, and upheld the reality of it, and to some extent of all that had happened during that expedition. And indeed, Mr. Golyadkin had known long before, that something was being got up among them, that there was someone else with them. But after all, thinking it over thoroughly, he made up his mind to keep quiet, to submit and not to protest for the time. They are simply plotting to frighten me, perhaps, and when they see that I don't mind, that I make no protest, but keep perfectly quiet and put up with it meekly, they'll give it up of themselves, give it up of their own accord. Such, then, were the thoughts in the mind of Mr. Golyadkin as, stretching in his bed, trying to rest his exhausted limbs, he waited for Petrushka to come into his room as usual. He waited for a full quarter of an hour. He heard the lazy scamp fiddling about it with the samovar behind the screen, and yet he could not bring himself to call him. We may say more. Mr. Golyadkin was a little afraid of confronting Petrushka. Why, goodness knows, he thought. Goodness knows how that rascal looks at it all. He keeps saying nothing, but he has his own ideas. At last, the door creaked and Petrushka came in with a tray in his hands. Mr. Golyadkin stole a timid glance at him, impatiently waiting to see what would happen, waiting to see whether he would not say something about a certain circumstance. But Petrushka said nothing. He was, on the contrary, more silent, more glum, and ill-humored than usual. He looked askance from under his brows at everything. Altogether, it was evident that he was very much put about something. He did not even once glance at his master, which, by the way, rather piqued the latter. Seeing all he had brought on the table, he turned and went out of the room without a word. He knows all about it, the scoundrel, Mr. Golyadkin grumbled to himself as he took his tea. Yet our hero did not address a single question to his servant, though Petrushka came into his room several times afterwards on various errands. Mr. Golyadkin was in great trepidation of spirit. He dreaded going to the office. He had a strong presentiment that there he would find something that would not be just so. You may be sure, he thought, that as soon as you go, you will light upon something. Isn't it better to endure in patience? Isn't it better to wait a bit now? Let them do what they like there, but I'd rather stay here a bit today, recover my strength, get better, and think over the whole affair more thoroughly. Then afterwards I could seize the right moment, fall upon them like a snow from the sky, and get off scot-free myself. Reasoning like this, Mr. Golyadkin smoked pipe after pipe. Time was flying. It was already nearly 9:30. Why, it's 9:30 already, thought Mr. Golyadkin. It's late for me to make my appearance. Besides, I'm ill. Of course I'm ill. I'm certainly ill. Who denies it? What's the matter with me? If they send to make inquiries, let the executive clerk come, and, indeed, what is the matter with me really? My back aches, I have a cough, and a cold in my head, and in fact, it's out of the question for me to go out, utterly out of the question in such weather. I might be taken ill, and very likely die. Nowadays especially, the death rate is so high. With such reasoning, Mr. Golyadkin succeeded at last in setting his conscience to rest, and defended himself against the reprimands he expected from Andrei Filipovich for neglect of his duty. As a rule in such cases, our hero was particularly fond of justifying himself in his own eyes with all sorts of irrefutable arguments, and so completely setting his conscience at rest. And so now, having completely soothed his conscience, he took up his pipe, filled it, and had no sooner settled down comfortably to smoke, when he jumped up quickly from the sofa, flung away the pipe, briskly washed, shaved, and brushed his hair, got into his uniform, and so on, snatched up some papers, and flew to the office. Mr. Golyadkin went into his department timidly, in quivering expectation of something unpleasant, an expectation which was none the less disagreeable for being vague and unconscious. He sat timidly down in his invariable place next to head clerk, Anton Antonovich Syetotochkin. Without looking at anything or allowing his attention to be distracted, he plunged into the contents of the papers that lay before him. He made up his mind and vowed himself to avoid, as far as possible, anything provocative, anything that might compromise him, such as indiscreet questions, jests, or seemingly allusions to any incidents of the previous evening. He made up his mind also to abstain from the usual interchange of civilities with his colleagues, such as inquiries after health and such like. But evidently it was impossible, out of the question to keep to this. Anxiety and uneasiness in regard to anything near him that was annoying always worried him far more than the annoyance itself. And that was why, in spite of his inward vows to refrain from entering into anything, whatever happened, as to keep aloof from everything, Mr. Golyadkin from time to time, on the sly, very, very quietly, raised his head and stealthily looked about him right to left, peeped at the countenances of his colleagues, and tried to gather where there was not something new and particular in them, referring to himself, and with sinister motives concealed from him. He assumed that there must be a connection between all that had happened yesterday and all that surrounded him now. At last, in his misery, he began to long for something, goodness knows what, to happen to put an end to it, even some calamity. He did not care. At this point, destiny caught Mr. Golyadkin. He had hardly felt this desire when his doubts were solved in this strange and most unexpected manner. The door leading from the next room suddenly gave a soft and timid creak, as though to indicate that the person about to enter was a very unimportant one, and a figure, very familiar to Mr. Golyadkin, stood shyly before the very table at which our hero was seated. The latter did not raise his head. No, he only stole a glance at him, the tiniest glance, but he knew all. He understood all, to every detail. He grew hot with shame, and buried his devoted head in his papers with precisely the same object with which the ostrich, pursued by hunters, hides his head in the burning sand. The new arrival bowed to Andrei Filipovich, and thereupon he heard a voice speaking in the regulation tone of condescending tone of politeness with which all persons in authority address their subordinates in public offices. "Take a seat here," said Andrei Filipovich, mentioning the newcomer to Anton Antovich's table. "Here, opposite Mr. Golyadkin, and will soon give you something to do." Andrei Filipovich ended by making a rapid gesture that decorously admonished the newcomer of his duty, and then he immediately became engrossed in the study of the papers that lay in a heap before him. Mr. Golyadkin lifted his eyes at last, and that he did not fall into a swoon was simply because he had foreseen it all from the first, that he had been forewarned from the first, guessing in his soul who the stranger was. Mr. Golyadkin's first movement was to look quickly about him, to see whether there were any whispering, any office joke being cracked on this subject, whether anyone's face was agape with wonder, whether, indeed, someone had not fallen under the table from terror. But to his intense astonishment, there was no sign of anything of the sort. The behavior of his colleagues and companions surprised him. It seemed contrary to the dictates of common sense. Mr. Golyadkin was positively scared at this extraordinary resident. The fact spoke for itself. It was a strange, horrible, uncanny thing. It was enough to rouse anyone. All this, of course, only passed rapidly through Mr. Golyadkin's mind. He felt as though he were burning in a slow fire, and indeed, there was enough to make him. The figure that was sitting opposite Mr. Golyadkin now was his terror, was his shame, was his nightmare of the evening before. In short, was Mr. Golyadkin himself. Not the Mr. Golyadkin who was sitting now in his chair, with his mouth wide open and his pen petrified in his hand. Not the one who acted as assistant to his chief. Not the one who liked to efface himself and slink away in the crowd. Not the one whose deportment plainly said, "Don't touch me, and I won't touch you," or "Don't interfere with me. You see I'm not touching you." No, this was another Mr. Golyadkin, quite different, yet at the same time exactly like the first. The same height, the same figure, the same clothes, the same boldness. In fact, nothing, absolutely nothing, was lacking to complete the likeness, so that if one were to set them side by side, nobody, absolutely nobody, could have taken to distinguish which was the real Mr. Golyadkin and which was the new one, which was the original and which was the copy. Our hero was, if the comparison can be made, in the position of a man upon whom some practical joker had stealthily, by way of jest, turned a burning glass. What does it mean? Is it a dream? He wondered. Is it reality or the continuation of what happened yesterday? And besides, by what right is this all being done? Who sanctioned such a clerk? Who authorized this? Am I asleep? Am I in a waking dream? Mr. Golyadkin tried pinching himself, even tried to screw up his courage to pinch someone else. No, it was not a dream, and that was all about it. Mr. Golyadkin felt that the sweat was trickling down him in big drops. He felt that what was happening to him was something incredible, unheard of, and for that very reason was, to complete his misery, utterly unseemly, for Mr. Golyadkin realized and felt how disadvantageous it was to be the first example of such a burlesque adventure. He even began to doubt his own existence, as though he were prepared for anything and had been longing for his doubts to be settled in any way whatever. Yet the actual reality was startling in its unexpectedness. His misery was poignant and overwhelming. At times he lost all power of thought and memory. Coming to himself after such a moment, he noticed that he was mechanically and unconsciously moving the pen over the paper. Mistrustful of himself, he began going over what he had written, and could make nothing of it. At last the other Mr. Golyadkin, who had been sitting discreetly and decorously at the table, got up and disappeared through the door into the other room. Mr. Golyadkin looked round. Everything was quiet. He heard nothing but the scratching of pens, the rustle of turning over pages, and conversations in the corners furthest from Andrei Filipovitch's table. Mr. Golyadkin looked at Anton Antonovitch, and as, in all probability, our hero's countenance fully reflected his real condition, and harmonized with the whole position, and was consequently, from one point of view, very remarkable, good-natured Anton Antonovitch, laying aside his pen, inquired after his health with marked sympathy. "I'm very well, thank God, Anton Antonovitch," said Mr. Golyadkin, stammering. I am perfectly well. I am all right now, Anton Antonovitch," he added uncertainly, not yet fully trusting Anton Antonovitch, whose name he had mentioned so often. "I fancied you were not quite well, though that's not to be wondered at. No, indeed. Nowadays especially, there's such a lot of illnesses going about. Do you know?" "Yes, Anton Antonovitch, I know there's a lot of illness. I did not mean that, Anton Antonovitch," Mr. Golyadkin went on, looking intently at Anton Antonovitch. "You see, Anton Antonovitch, I don't even know how you, that is, I mean to say, how to approach this matter, Anton Antonovitch." "How so?" "Do you know? I must confess I don't quite understand. You must explain, you know, in what ways you are in difficulties," said Anton Antonovitch, beginning to be in difficulties himself, seeing that there were actually tears in Mr. Golyadkin's eyes. "Really, Anton Antonovitch, there's a clerk here, Anton Antonovitch." "Well, I don't understand it now." "I mean to say, Anton Antonovitch, there's a new clerk here." "Yes, there is. A namesake of yours." "What?" cried Mr. Golyadkin. "I say a namesake of yours. His name's Golyadkin too. Isn't he a brother of yours?" "No, Anton Antonovitch, You don't say so. Why, I thought he must be a relation of yours. Do you know, there's a sort of family likeness." Mr. Golyadkin was petrified with astonishment, and for the moment he could not speak. To treat so lightly such a horrible, unheard-of thing, a thing undeniably rare and curious in its way, a thing which would have amazed even an unconcerned spectator, to speak of a family resemblance when he could see himself as in a looking-glass. "Do you know, Yakov Petrovitch, what I advise you to do?" Anton Antonovitch went on. "Go and consult a doctor. Do you know, you look somehow quite unwell. Your eyes look peculiar. You know, there's a particular expression in them." "No, Anton Antonovitch, I feel, of course, that is, I keep wanting to ask about this clerk." "Well?" "That is, have you noticed, Anton Antonovitch, something peculiar about him? Something very marked?" "That is?" "That is, I mean, Anton Antonovitch, a striking likeness with somebody. For instance, with me, for instance? You spoke just now, you see, Anton Antonovitch, of a family likeness. You let slip the remark, you know there really are sometimes twins exactly alike, like 2 drops of water, so that they can't be told apart. Well, it's that I mean." "To be sure," said Anton Antonovitch, after a moment's thought, speaking as though he was struck by the fact for the first time. "Yes, indeed, you are right. There is a striking likeness.
And you are quite right in what you say. You really might be mistaken for one another," he went on, opening his eyes wider and wider. "And do you know, Yakov Petrovitch, it's positively a marvelous likeness, fantastic in fact, and the saying is, that is, just as you. Have you observed, Yakov Petrovitch? I wanted to ask you to explain it. Yes, I must confess I didn't take particular notice at first. It's wonderful. It's really wonderful. And you know, you are not a native of these parts, are you, Yakov Petrovitch? No? He's not from this part, you know, either. Perhaps he comes from the same part of the country as you do. Where, may I make bold to inquire, did your mother live for the most part? You say, Anton Antonovitch, that he is not a native of these parts? No, he is not, and indeed how strange it is, continued the talkative Anton Antonovitch, for whom it was a genuine treat to gossip. It may well arouse curiosity, and yet, you know, it might pass him by, brush against him, without noticing anything. But you mustn't be upset about it. It's a thing that does happen. Do you know, the same thing, I must tell you, happened to my aunt on my mother's side. She saw her own double before her death. No, excuse me for interrupting you, Anton Antonovitch. I wanted to find out, Anton Antonovitch, how that clerk, that is, on what footing is he here, in the place of Semyon Ivanovitch, to fill the vacancy left by his death. The post was vacant, so he was appointed. Do you know, I'm told poor Semyon Ivanovitch left 3 children, all tiny dots. The widow fell at the feet of His Excellency. They do say he's hiding something. She's got a bit of money, but she's hiding it. No, Anton Antonovitch, I was still referring to that circumstance. You mean, to be sure, but why are you so interested in that? I tell you not to upset yourself. And this is temporary to some extent. Why, after all, you know, you have nothing to do with it. So it has been ordained by God Almighty. It's His will, and it is sinful repining. His wisdom is apparent in it. And as far as I can make out, Yakov Petrovitch, you are not to blame in any way. There are all sorts of strange things in the world. Mother Nature is liberal with her gifts, and you are not called upon to answer for it. You won't be responsible. Here, for instance, you have heard, I expect, of those, what's their name? Oh, the Siamese twins who are joined together at the back, live and eat and sleep together. I'm told they get a lot of money. Allow me, Anton Antonovitch. I understand. But what of it? It's no matter, I tell you. As far as I can see, there's nothing for you to upset yourself about. After all, he's a clerk. As a clerk, he seems to be a capable man. He says his name is Golyadkin, that he's not a native of this district, and that he's a titular councillor. He had a personal interview with His Excellency. And how did His Excellency? It was all right. I am told he gave a satisfactory account of himself, gave his reasons. Said, "It's like this, Your Excellency," and that he was without means and anxious to enter the service, and would be particularly flattered to be serving under His Excellency. All that was proper, you know. He expressed himself neatly. He must be a sensible man. But of course he came with a recommendation. He couldn't have got in without that. Oh, from whom? That is, I mean, who is it has had a hand in this shameful business? Yes, a good recommendation, I'm told. His Excellency, I'm told, laughed with Andrei Filipovich. Laughed with Andrei Filipovich? Yes, he only just smiled and said that it was all right, and that he had nothing against it, so long as he did his duty. Well, and what more? You relieve me to some extent, Anton Antonovitch. Go on, I entreat you. Excuse me, I must tell you again. Well, then, come. It's nothing. It's a very simple matter. You mustn't upset yourself, I tell you, and there's nothing suspicious about it. No, that is, Anton Antonovitch, I want to ask you, didn't His Excellency say anything more about me, for instance? Well, to be sure, no, nothing of the sort. You can set your mind quite at rest. You know, it is, of course, a rather striking circumstance, and at first, why, here for instance, I scarcely noticed it. I really don't know why I didn't notice it until you mentioned it. But you can set your mind at rest entirely. He said nothing peculiar, absolutely nothing. added good-natured Anton Antonovitch, getting up from his chair. So then, Anton Antonovitch, Oh, you must excuse me. Here I've been gossiping about these trivial matters, and I've business that is important and urgent. I must inquire about it.
Anton Antonovitch, Andrei Filipovitch's voice sounded, summoning him politely. His Excellency has been asking for you.
This minute, I'm coming this minute, Andrei Filipovitch.
And Anton Antonovitch, taking a pile of papers, flew off first to Andrei Filipovitch, and then turned into His Excellency's room.
Then, what's the meaning of it? Thought Mr. Golyadkin. Is there some sort of game going on? So the wind's in that quarter now. That's just as well. So things have taken a much pleasanter turn.
Our hero said to himself, rubbing his hands, and so delighted that he scarcely knew where he was.
So opposition is an ordinary thing. So it turns out to be all nonsense. It comes to nothing at all. No one has done anything really, and they are not budging, the rascals. They are sitting busy over their work. That's splendid. Splendid. I like the good-natured fellow. I've always liked him, and I'm always ready to respect him. Though it must be said one doesn't know what to think, this Anton Antonovitch. I'm afraid to trust him. His hair's grey, and he's getting shaky. It's an immense and glorious thing that His Excellency said nothing and let it pass. It's a good thing. I approve. Only why does Andrei Filipovitch interfere with his grins? What's he got to do with it? The old rogue. Always on my track. Always. Like a black cat, on the watch to run against a man's path. Always thwarting and annoying a man. Always annoying and thwarting a man.
Mr. Golyadkin looked around him again, and again his hopes revived.
Yet he felt he was troubled by some remote idea, an unpleasant idea.
It even occurred to him that he might try somehow to make up to the clerks, to be the first in the field even, perhaps when leaving the office or going up to them as though about his work, to drop a hint in the course of conversation, saying,
"This is how it is. What a striking likeness, gentlemen. A strange circumstance. A burlesque farce."
That is, treat it all lightly, and in this way sound the depth of the danger.
Devils breed in still waters,
our hero concluded inwardly. Mr. Golyadkin, however, only contemplated this. He thought better of it in time. He realized that this would be going too far.
"That's your temperament,"
he said to himself, tapping himself lightly on the forehead.
"As soon as you gain anything, you are delighted. You're a simple soul. No, you and I had better be patient, Yakov Petrovitch. Let us wait and be patient."
Nevertheless, as we have mentioned already, Mr. Golyadkin was buoyed up with the most confident hopes, feeling as though he had risen from the dead.
"No matter," he thought. "It's as though 100 tons had been lifted off my chest. Here is a circumstance, to be sure. The box has been opened by the lid. Krylov is right. A rather chap, a rogue, that Krylov, and a great favourite. And as for him, let him work in the office. And good luck to him so long as he doesn't meddle or interfere with anyone. Let him work in the office. I consent and approve."
Meanwhile the hours were passing, flying by, and before he noticed, the time had struck 4. The office was closed. Andrei Filipovitch took his hat, and all followed his example in due course. Mr. Golyadkin dawdled a little on purpose, long enough to be the last to go out when all the others had gone their several ways. Going out from the street, he felt as though he were in paradise, so that he even felt inclined to go a longer way round, and to walk along the Nevsky Prospect.
"To be sure, this is destiny," thought our hero. "This unexpected turn in affairs. And the weather's more cheerful, and the frost and the little sledges. And the frost suits the Russian. The Russian gets on capitiously with the frost. I like the Russian. And the dear little snow, and the first few flakes in autumn. The sportsman would say, it would be nice to go shooting hares in the first snow. Well there, it doesn't matter."
This was how Mr. Golyadkin's enthusiasm found expression. Yet something was fretting in his brain. Not exactly melancholy, but at times he had such a gnawing at his heart that he did not know how to find relief.
"Let us wait for the day, though, and then we shall rejoice. And after all, you know, what does it matter? Come, let us think it over. Let us look at it. Come, let us consider it, my young friend. let us consider it. Why, a man's exactly like you in the first place, absolutely the same. Well, what is there in that? If there is such a man, why should I weep over it? What is it to me? I stand aside, I whistle to myself, and that's all. That's what I've laid myself open to, and that's all about it. Let him work in the office. Well, it's strange and marvelous, they say, that the Siamese twins. But why bring in Siamese twins? They are twins, of course, but even great men, you know, sometimes look queer creatures. In fact, we know from history that the famous Sumarov used to crow like a cock. But there, he did all that with political motives, and he was a great general. But what are generals after all? But I keep myself to myself, that's all, and I don't care about anyone else. And, secure in my innocence, I scorn my enemies. I am not one to intrigue, and I am proud of it. Gentle, straightforward, neat and nice, meek and mild. All at once, Mr. Golyadkin broke off. His tongue failed him, and he began trembling like a leaf. He even closed his eyes for a minute. Hoping, however, that the object of his terror was only an illusion, he opened his eyes at last and stole a timid glance to the right. No, it was not an illusion. His acquaintance of that morning was tripping along by his side, smiling, peeping into his face, and apparently seeking an opportunity to begin a conversation with him. The conversation had not begun, however. They both walked like this for about 50 paces. All Mr. Golyadkin's efforts were concentrated on muffling himself up, hiding himself in his coat, and pulling his hat down as far as possible over his eyes. To complete his mortification, his companion's coat and hat looked as though they had been taken off Mr. Golyadkin himself. "Sir," our hero articulated at last, trying to speak almost in a whisper and not looking at his companion. "We are going different ways, I believe. I am convinced of it, in fact," he said, after a pause. "I'm convinced, indeed, that you quite understand me," he added, rather severely, in conclusion. "I could have wished," his companion pronounced at last. "I could have wished. No doubt he will be magnanimous and pardon me. I don't know to whom addresses myself here. My circumstances. I trust he will pardon my intrusiveness. I fancied, indeed, that, moved by compassion, you showed some interest in me this morning. On my side, I felt drawn to you from the first moment. At this point, Mr. Golyadkin inwardly wished that his companion might sink into the earth. "If I might venture to hope that you would accord me with an indulgent hearing, Yakov Petrovitch." You had better come home with me," answered Mr. Golyadkin. "We will cross now to the other side of the Nevsky Prospect. It will be more convenient for us there, and then by the little back street. We'd better go by the back street." "Very well. By all means let us go by the back street," our hero's meek companion responded timidly, suggesting by the tone of his reply that it was not for him to choose, and that in his position he was quite prepared to accept the back street. As for Mr. Golyadkin, he was utterly unable to grasp what was happening to him. He could not believe in himself. He could not get over his amazement.